The endless cycle of violence between settlers and the Cheyenne had left deep wounds and shattered lives. The Cheyenne warriors, seen as fierce enemies, were preparing to defend their people against attacks that threatened their very existence. But when Tom Sawyer found himself protecting a wounded girl named Ayanna, everything he thought he knew was challenged in the most unexpected way. Just wait until you discover how this unlikely bond turned the tide, and why justice ultimately prevailed in this powerful tale. Tom Sawyer was a man carved by solitude and hardship, living on the unforgiving edge of the Wild West. Years of loneliness and constant vigilance had weathered him like the cracked leather of his worn boots. The vast, dusty plains stretched out endlessly before him, a land as harsh and unforgiving as the times he endured. News arrived one dry afternoon. A nearby Cheyenne camp had been struck with sudden violence. Rumors swirled quickly among the settlers. Fires had burned, families scattered, and old wounds reopened. For Tom, this was just another bitter chapter in a long story of clashes and mistrust that seemed to have no end. His heart hardened by these constant conflicts. Tom's thoughts turned sharp and cold. He saw the Cheyenne warriors as shadows looming over his land, threats to the fragile peace he fought daily to maintain. Every tale of violence deepened a scar on his soul, fueling a growing storm of bitterness. It was a hatred born not from cruelty, but from the exhaustion of endless struggle, from watching neighbors suffer and feeling powerless to stop the cycle. Mounting his horse, Tom rode into the wind, his jaw set tight. The sun sank low behind the jagged horizon, casting long shadows that mirrored the darkness gathering inside him. In his mind, there was no room for mercy, only the fierce determination to protect what was his, to stand firm against the unrest that threatened to consume everything he had built. As the last rays of daylight faded into twilight, Tom's eyes caught a faint movement near the edge of his ranch. There, barely visible against the dusty ground, lay a young Cheyenne girl, her small frame trembling with weakness. Her name was Ayanna, Eternal Blossom, a name that spoke of hope and life even amidst the harshness surrounding her. Tom's heart tightened. All the anger and bitterness that had clouded his mind began to shift. Here was no enemy, no fierce warrior standing against him, but a fragile child, overwhelmed by pain and fear. Her breath was shallow, and her eyes, though dimmed by exhaustion, held a quiet plea for help. Without hesitation, Tom slid from his horse and approached her gently, mindful of the trust she might still hold. He wrapped his coat carefully around her shoulders, shielding her from the creeping chill of night. The rough fabric was a small comfort in an indifferent world. In that moment, Tom saw beyond the divisions that had long defined his view of the world. He understood that her suffering was real, no different from his own. The endless conflict had trapped them both in its unforgiving grip, but she was not the enemy. She was a child caught in a story far larger than herself. A quiet compassion stirred inside him, softening the hard edges of his heart. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years, a reminder that even in the wildest places, humanity could still bloom, fragile but unyielding. The quiet of dusk was shattered when Tom's sharp eyes caught a sudden glimmer far across the valley, high on the ridge. Rifles, hundreds of them, lined up in careful formation, their cold metal catching the last light of day. Around 250 Cheyenne warriors stood ready, poised to defend their people from an approaching threat, a force of settlers driven by fear and suspicion. A surge of anger boiled up inside Tom, not the familiar bitter rage directed at the girl he had just saved, but a deeper, fiercer fire. This was the anger of seeing the injustice that had rooted itself so deeply in this land, the injustice that kept feeding the endless cycle of violence between two peoples who had no reason to hate each other so fiercely. His fists clenched, not in hate toward Ayanna or her people, but at the harsh realities forcing them into this desperate stand. It was a rage born from years of watching neighbors turned foes, friends lost to misunderstandings, and peace drowned by suspicion and fear. Yet beneath that anger lay something stronger, a resolve. Tom understood that the path ahead demanded more than old grudges and division. It required courage, the kind that defies history and challenges the shadows of the past. With steady breath, he tightened his grip on the reins and looked down at Ayanna, her fragile form still wrapped in his coat. In that moment, Tom made a choice. He would stand with her, not as an enemy, but as an ally against the injustice that threatened to destroy them all. The wild wind carried the weight of that decision as the sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the valley poised on the brink of a new, uncertain dawn. As night embraced the valley, a quiet transformation began to take hold. The rifles once raised with tension on the ridge no longer gleamed with the promise of conflict, but stood as silent reminders of a shared struggle, one for survival, understanding, and peace. The fragile alliance between Tom and Ayanna grew stronger with each passing hour, bridging the gap between two worlds that had long been divided by fear and mistrust. Tom's choice to protect the girl, once a symbol of enmity, sparked something unexpected, a tentative truce. Word spread swiftly among the settlers and the Cheyenne alike, stirring a realization that their future might lie not in endless confrontation, but in dialogue and empathy. Around the flickering campfires, old stories were exchanged, wounds acknowledged, and tentative hands reached out. The air, once thick with tension, began to soften as both sides glimpsed a new possibility, a chance to move beyond the shadows of the past. Against all odds, from the depths of hatred and pain, a new hope emerged. It was a hope not born of forgetting or ignoring the past, but of choosing a different path forward. The bond formed that night, fragile yet unbreakable, promised a future where understanding could flourish and peace might take root. In the stillness of that shared moment, beneath the vast star-studded sky, two worlds once thought irreconcilable began to weave together, whispering the first promises of lasting harmony.